Well, in that case, good morning. Sorry for those who are just there to subject you to some Icelandic folk music. But as I was saying to Susie just before, maybe deep down, I just want to be an Icelandic folk band. So we continue on today, looking at the relationship between policy and politics. What I would like to do today is explore a little bit about some theories of politics that will help us to understand what the purpose of government is, and then what the purpose of evidence in government is. Now, what I'm going to do, I will do in a second. I'll start sharing my screen. But we did get a couple of requests from those who are joining in later in the, watching later and then joining in the later tubes, that I should pause during any bits where you're doing group activities and getting feedback so that they don't get spoilers, which is entirely legitimate for those people later. But what I would ask you here today, this morning, if you notice if I have paused the recording and it hasn't gone back on when we're doing more talky talk, then just let me know and we'll go from there. So I will begin, I will share my screen.
Oh, what?
No, oh, Sarah.
And
Oh, God.
now yell out during this bit if you have any questions as we go. Also, where's the chat button? There it is. All right, theories of politics. I'm going to start with a big long series of questions. Now, I don't want to know how you would actually answer these questions. These are all available. I just put the slides up in Wattle now. I don't know how you'd answer these questions, but I want you to think about how you would answer them. And I want you to think about a couple of things. One, if you've got an answer straight away, keep it to yourself. You don't have to tell everyone what your answer is. That's entirely fine. But I want you to think, yes, if you've got an answer, but two, if that answer was easy or if that answer was hard. It's important to try and think, okay, what sorts of things are going into each of these questions? And then we'll start exploring a little bit more of them later. And just to stress again, I don't want your answers. Now, normally in class, that would mean people singing out an answer. I don't want that, but you can react to these if you want, but don't tell me what your answers. I'm not here to judge your answers. First question. Now, these are all from the ANU Vote Compass, which is a tool that's put out it's by ANU, and there's a couple of other tools that do this. Before every election here in Australia, but other people do it in other parts of the world, they ask about 30 or 40 questions. And it allows people to sort of understand, okay, what are their different positions on different things? So question number one, it starts with a pretty strong question there for politics. Do you think that women should readily be able to obtain an abortion if they request one? You can answer in your head, definitely yes, mostly no, definitely no. Is there another little button on the side there that I can't see? No answer. I think no answer is, okay, you could put no answer as well. Write these down if you like on a piece of paper, just so you can reflect on them later. Question two. Should the recreational use of marijuana by adults remain a criminal offence? Definitely yes, mostly no, definitely no. You can also weight your answer. This is more for the people that are calculating these things in this online tool. If this is an important topic for you or an unimportant topic, so you could go definitely yes, very important topic. Definitely no, very important topic. Yeah, Harley's just put the link in the chat there. They do change them every year. So this is the questions from last year's federal election. Should governments allow pill testing at music festivals? Definitely yes, mostly no, definitely no. Do you oppose same-sex couples being given the same rights to marry as couples consisting of a man and a woman? A bit old now, but I guess you could still have opinions on that. Do you think that terminally ill patients should be able to end their lives with medical assistance? Now, we've got a few more questions to go here, but I want to pause just for a second and just get quick reactions from people, how easy or hard each of these questions have been to answer. Throw it in the chat or yell out if you want, or put your hand up. Easy, easy, very easy, very easy. Relatively easy. Excellent. I like to, yes, okay, that probably was a, Zuleika, do you oppose same-sex marriage tricked me because the question is a negative. Yeah. Isaac, you mentioned hard. Can you tell me a little bit about what's making them harder for you?
I think I just don't know where I stand on various different issues.
Okay, entirely legitimate, entirely legitimate.
I think I don't have the life experience.
Don't have the life experience. Okay, fair enough. Helen says, I have to admit at a younger age, I would have thought about it more about it. Hang on, you would have thought more at a younger age because you needed to think more, or because you didn't, by now you've worked out those answers. You know the answer now. You know the answer. It's okay. So you've had those conversations and those internal processing moments where you know, okay, this is what I know what it will be.
Yeah, I also have to kind of admit to not really have been too involved with politics or these sorts of questions before I hit about 25, to be honest. I was a bit ambivalent.
Entirely legitimate.
Yeah, and then once I started actually caring, I guess, a bit more and being a bit more engaged with civics, these questions are now, to me, I find them easy. For me, I know my answer, but if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have been like, oh, I never really thought about it.
I think I would assume, can I get from those who wrote easy or very easy, is it because you know your answer, or because you could think through them very quickly and grappled with what's going on there? Both. Okay, good. Let's see if maybe there are some questions in this bunch that maybe get a little bit harder. Hopefully they get a little bit harder. Okay, where are we up to? So terminally ill patients should be able to end their lives with medical assistance. We've done that one. Oh, just one question as we go. How often are people using the definitely buckets as opposed to the mostly buckets or the no answer buckets? Not considering whether yes or no, but are people emphatic in their opinions, or more towards the middle? Definitely all the time. Definitely. Yeah, there's no middle ground on this one. They are forcing you off. Well, there is the no answer that they put over there, but they're otherwise forcing you off so people are very definite on things. Helen's cheating. Not cheating. That's fine. That's fine. Right. Let's keep going. Question 9. Should people who break the law be given stiffer sentences? Definitely yes, mostly yes, mostly no, definitely no. As Andrew says, context please. I was thinking, and I was gonna say straight away, you're not allowed to ask for, not allowed to say it depends. It does depend. Of course it does. These sorts of questions are entirely abstract. But the problem is, I mean, not the problem, but one of the underpinning theories of governance that drive most societies is that things have to be done in the abstract. We have to choose our elected representatives to have general positions on things, not on the specifics. So, for example, should people who break the law be given stiffer sentences? We can imagine the context of one particular case. You know, one particular, it's a murder, but maybe it was in self-defense. Maybe it was an abused spouse, and something going on there is very different from other sorts of murders. Now, we know all of that, but we employ our politicians to make these decisions a little bit much more in the abstract than on the context of every particular issue. Should aged care be mainly the responsibility of the government rather than the pensioners themselves or their families? The survey designer in me says you've got a double barrel here. Because, I mean, some people would say, oh, it's the responsibility of the pensioners, not their families. Other people might say, oh, it's the responsibility of their families. And other people might say it's the responsibility of the government. So that's a little bit of a flawed question. But let's say government versus families. As Zoe says, and I was thinking we would get to some tougher questions straight away. This question is tough. This is the people who break the law should be given stiffer sentences, because sentencing rules vary. So some crimes, the sentencing is too lenient, but for others, the minimum sentence is too hard. We have in some jurisdictions mandatory minimum sentencing for minor crimes, and then we see white-collar criminals who devastate millions of lives and yet don't get very much punishment at all. And yes, as Lee says there, having a personal stake changes your answer too. If you are a pensioner, hopefully, there are a couple of ways of approaching politics. One is it's all about self-interest. So every policy that either political party gives out is in some senses an attempt to curry your vote based on, will this make you better off? Other people will say, no, this is more about what should society be like? Should we want people to be looked after by the government or by the families or something like that? So in that sense, it's probably worth thinking as you write the answers to these down, where do you draw your response from? What sorts of things are you thinking about? Should welfare recipients who fail to comply with reporting obligations have their payments stopped? Definitely yes, mostly no, definitely no. Should the Constitution be changed to recognise Indigenous Australians? Should the voting age be lowered to 16 years? Classically, a perfect example of a case that cannot affect the people who are able to vote on that. Only 18-year-olds will be able to decide if the vote can be lowered to 16-year-olds, unless 16 and 17-year-olds have some sort of revolution and demand it. I'm not quite sure how that would happen. Helen says lower voting and drinking. Should Australia remain a constitutional monarchy with the Queen as the head of state? Just remember, we here in Australia, it is now 21 years since we were the only people to vote for the Queen. Should the Constitution be changed so that dual citizens can sit in and run for Parliament? Should political parties introduce gender quotas in order to increase the number of women in Parliament? Is that an easy question or a hard question? Definitely, some saying easy, some saying hard. Quota of 0 scumbags would be good, but harder to follow through on. Should the current minimum wage be substantially increased? Definitely yes, definitely no. Again, it might depend. Is reducing government debt currently the most important economic issue facing the country? Obviously, I believe that, well, this was written before COVID. So I don't know if this, I'm sure this a version of this question would definitely come in a future version of Smart Vote or Vote Compass or whatever, whichever one it is. However, I don't know if it will be phrased in exactly the same sort of way. Susie, can you just flesh that out? Some of these are really hard as an expat because I entirely support what you're arguing. How contextual are these questions? Because government debt is a thing that countries all over the world face.
I guess like anything that involves like the quotas in parliamentary politics, like I'm still wrapping my mind around how parliamentary politics works.
Yep.
And like I know my own thoughts about quotas in general, but in the context of like the context is the political system, and the political system is something that's really different from the American political system.
Yes.
And so like that, I've made an answer. Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. You guys are real lucky that way. But and the same is true of a few other of the questions that were like the broader context sits within the Australian system, and where that differs from my home country. It can be difficult for me to fully understand what the debate is here.
So some of these are all of these questions, or nearly all of them, are questions that all countries in the world could potentially grapple with. Some countries might not even be looking at them yet, or they've dealt with them 20 years ago, but in general, most of these questions are the sorts of questions that societies around the world will face. Should we have minimum wages or not? Is gender in parliament a problem or not? Is government debt an issue? All governments will deal with these, and all people, all politically engaged people, will have opinions on these. But as I'll come towards at the bottom of this class today, the context of each country matters enormously. You know, the debates that we had last year and 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 100 years ago in different countries will shape enormously the sorts of debates that you can have in those countries. There's a concept that is worth framing, worth raising here, called the Overton window. Now, I can use my chalkboard. That's awesome. So the Overton window, it was actually invented by a guy who's a fascist. So I feel bad about quoting it, but so too the Likert scale. The Likert scale was totally racist when that was originally made up. But the Overton window says that if this is political discourse from left to right, that there is a window in the middle of a sort of mainstream discourse. So we can call that, well, that's the Overton window. Now, all the way over here in the left-hand side are intensely Marxist ideas. So for example, nationalize all the banks, nationalize all of the big profit organizations, and they should be under government control. Over to the far right, extremely libertarian views. There should be no government. Now, within that mix, you can see all sorts of other things. In the middle are the sorts of mainstream political debates that we have most of the time. So there are ideas about, okay, how much government debt should we have? Should it be a bit more or a bit less or something like that? But not going out to these extremes. The point of the Overton window is that political campaigners, and this guy Overton, he was a fascist, and he said, what we've got to do gradually over time is shift this window. So instead of being to there, we shift it over to here so that we can have a new range of discourse that are a little bit more extreme about what is permissible within mainstream normal debate. Obviously, at the same time, everyone else is pulling in the other direction as well. And there are forces in the middle to try and keep things roughly in the middle. So the Overton window is just an idea about what sorts of things are legitimate for debate in each country. Now, of course, they are not permanent or universal laws. there is, in America, you would say that the general Overton window, say for example on guns, is far more over to this sort of way than most other countries. Similarly, debates about the role of government will be different in each country. And so the Overton window isn't a perfect or long-term position. It's just where people are happy with a mainstream political discussion. Any questions on that before we keep going with these? There's some bunch of comments there in the text about the Overton window. Yes, Justin says the Overton window explains why the radical left in the US are currently proposing policies universally accepted in Australia. So for example, Australia's Overton window might generally, and this is just a broad generalization, might sit here. The American Overton window might sit a little bit further over to the right. But of course, left to right is not a simplistic thing. Let's keep going. Okay, this is super precise for the last Australian election. Do you support policies to limit shareholders receiving a cash rebate on dividends? Very, very specific to Australian context in the last election. Skip it, don't worry. Should government continue to allow property investors to claim tax deductions, i.e. negative gearing? We'll skip that too. The Banking Royal Commission. Okay, here's one that again is more general to the global condition, but of course is also far more quite particular to Australia because of Australian politics and also Australian geography. Should asylum seekers who come by boat always be resettled offshore? Now, you could imagine other countries, of course, will deal with migration, legitimate migration, and those who are seeking asylum, but they'll come in very different pathways. A landlocked country, for example, Hungary, will have very different different geographical constraints from Australia or New Zealand, and very different politics. But there are definitely forces in many societies who argue things that locking the borders to all forms of immigration or some forms of immigration. And then there are others who would argue very much to be open and welcoming. So whilst this has particularity, the come by boat, resettled offshore, to Australian politics of the last 10 years, it also is a general question. Should the English language test for migrants applying for citizenship be made easier? I don't honestly know how hard it is. Has anyone done the English language for citizenship test? So the problem here, Emily, is difficult to answer without knowing how hard it currently is. You're asking for sensible details, whereas what this question is trying to do is just give you the knee-jerk stance. Which way should we go? Should we just make it harder? Should we just make it easier? Should the government reduce the number of migrants coming to Australia under family reunion visas? Should the government allow the opening of new coal mines? Your husband couldn't answer half the questions, Victoria. So what questions were you asked to answer, Victoria?
So this is the general test, not the English language test. It was all sorts of things about which level of government was responsible for which thing, like child services,
Okay.
aged care, etc. All those sorts of things, and he had very little idea about those sorts of questions, which was a worry. So
no doubt. I'm sure a lot of people can't quite answer who's responsible for childcare or aged care.
Yes, yeah. Some politicians, I imagine.
No doubt. Yeah, so new coal mines. Did I say Australia was an environmentally conscious country? I'm not sure if I. Do you want to flesh out what I said there, Zoe? I can clarify. I have opinions on whether Australia is an environmentally conscious country or not. I'll set it. Don't be a dobber, Sean. Indeed. What I would say on Australia's environmental record is that all countries are quite imperfect on environmental records. Some countries are definitely worse. Australia has an interesting track record of environmental protest. We've had some of the early strong environmental protests that led on to environmental movements around the world, and we have been involved in those sorts of things. However, the Australian government has been historically a government that has treated the land mass of the continent, Australia, as something that is basically for digging up or for growing stuff on as quickly as you can, which is not a great environmental record. So the picture is mixed. Do you think the government should provide more subsidies to solar and wind power generation? Do you think the government should introduce a price on carbon emissions? Again. Should privacy and civil liberties be protected at all costs, despite the threat of terrorism? And again, this is a web form. You're not allowed to ask for more details. Indeed, it's a loaded question. Do you think the government should remove Australian citizenship from dual nationals returning from foreign civil wars? What if they fought for the goodies? Are there goodies? I don't think there's goodies. There's no goodies. There's never goodies, Andrew. It's baddies all the way down. Yes, are we the baddies? Should Chinese investments in Australia be more highly regulated? Should the government do more to prevent foreign countries from interfering with Australia's political processes? I just read this morning another post about cyber trolling and Russian influence operations, and stepping up to at least as much as the 2016 election in the US. There's not a lot of evidence that cyber influence operations have happened here in Australia, but I think this question is talking more about in the general. So for example, cozy relationships with politicians, or cozy deals that support certain sorts of outcomes. Yeah, I'm sorry, Justin, no follow-up questions. There's a good theory of polling that says on one side, you could have a Likert scale, 1 to 5, for example, that might go definitely yes, mostly yes, I don't know, and then mostly no, definitely no. But if you give people the option of quibbling in the middle, then too often people sit on the fence. And it's important sometimes to push people off the fence. Which way are you going to fall? Which way is your knee jerk going to go? Now, there is the option here. I think the fact that they put it over all the way to the right there to say no answer suggests you are feeling bad about not answering something. And it is important to think, which way would we go? Raina, some of these questions are based on assumptions I don't agree with.
Yeah, it has underlying things. So if you talk about Australian political processes, if the political process was different, it may not be a problem.
Do you mean this particular question? Yes.
Well,
of
yeah,
course.
there's a few like that. They take certain things for granted, and then they start from there. But you may have jumped off the train before then.
Yes, of course.
You know, when did you stop beating your wife, sort of thing?
Indeed. Okay. So just to flesh out there that Emily's saying, did you want to say more on that, Emily? You've got pushing people to take a side without being fully informed is problematic, though. Do you want to say more on that, or shall I just respond to that straight away?
I think, I don't know, the example of Brexit comes to mind, where everyone was like forced to take a yes or no stance, often without being fully informed, and then giving the power to make this type of decision to people who might not be in a position to make it.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say is, well, firstly, the context of the question answering. So, for example, on this polling here, there's no real problem. If you say yes or no or anything on these questions, then the country is not going to leave the European Union based on your answer to a poll here. Brexit, obviously, was a far more high stakes moment of polling. And yes, I would certainly say that that was a referendum that was potentially highly flawed in its in the way it was prosecuted, the question that was asked, the way the campaign ran, and so that people were not as informed as they need to be. And I think the problem is you probably do need to have a yes or no on some things. You need to have a binary. You need to have, okay, which way do you go? Forcing people to step off the fence is part of saying, okay, even if you're just a tiny bit this way, which way is it going to be? But more information is probably, there is the more information button there. More information is a key thing of how we think about these sorts of questions.
Just on that, Will, because you brought up about the Republic vote 21 years ago. That a lot of 2020 hindsight on that is sort of saying that instead of being a yes or no question, Howard forced it to be a referendum on a particular model. And so
Yes.
A lot of people who would have voted yes voted no because they didn't like the proposed model.
Absolutely. So just to provide context here for what Sean is saying, that there was a movement growing in Australia in the 1990s to have a referendum on whether Australia should ditch the Queen as a head of state and have our own head of state, a president here in Australia. And it got to the point where it looked likely that a referendum was going to come. John Howard was the Prime Minister at the time, and he was very opposed to this happening. But rather than waiting for the next Prime Minister after him to capture that momentum and to successfully prosecute a referendum on having an Australian head of state, Howard decided, okay, the way that we can head this off is by deliberately proposing a referendum that will split those who want a republic. So it split those who wanted a republic into two camps, basically. The question was changing Australian head of state into something very similar-ish to now, but the difference would be that the Governor-General would become a president appointed by Parliament. And so for many people, many Republicans were saying, well, no, I don't want that. I want a president that I can elect. But many political scientists said, well, that's a big risk because you change the system of government an awful lot here. And this was quite successful. So you had two groups of people who wanted a republic, but couldn't agree on the process of electing the president, which is actually, it's a pretty key thing. And so then you get people saying, well, no, I'd rather not have that sort of republic if it's going to be what they called the politicians' republic. So successful, very successful move there to head off that vote, and we're still probably another 20 years away from having another vote on a republic. And I think it has been proposed very much that it will be very hard to do because people, I think in general, maybe want some sort of presidential system, but constitutional lawyers, political scientists very much think a presidential system would be a disaster for Australian politics. Yes, and ultimately, Brexit didn't propose anything precise. So Brexit just said, should we leave the European Union? And there are so many entanglements that mean that's a really complicated thing. And so there was a moment where David Cameron, straight away afterwards, could have articulated, okay, that's what it's going to be. But I think a successful referendum is one where constitutionally the outcome is precise. So, for example, the last successful referenda in Australia include things like including Indigenous people in the count in the census. That was in 1967, and Australia was quite a racist country before and is still quite a racist country, but that was a moment of being a tiny bit less racist. And at that point, it was quite a precise thing to argue for, and I think that 90% of people voted for it. However, you could have had a far fuzzier question that maybe would have been harder to answer. Harley, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, just with the referendum, it becomes quite a question of like, how do you ask that question neutrally? Because if you have multiple options, do you ask all three options and the winner, like the plurality wins, or do you say like yes, no, and then pick a system?
I think that if you were to prosecute this, if the Prime Minister prosecuting this wanted this, I think what you would have to do is have a yes, no. Do you want to be keep the Queen as the head of state or move to an Australian citizen head of state? And then following that, maybe straight away you stand in the booth and you answer a next question, or maybe 2 months later you come back and you vote on the model. And then there are different models here. So what they might be is, Australians directly elect the president via some sort of, everybody votes, or the states choose, or Parliament chooses, or just the Senate or the lower house. There's different models there. Or we import a royal family. We just have, I don't know, make Prince Harry an Australian citizen or something dumb. There are other models that you could choose. The difficulty, of course, is that I think any moment where you have constitutional lawyers pointing in a very different direction from constitutional lawyers and political scientists pointing in a very different direction from what is mainstream opinion, then they have a lot of work to do to move mainstream opinion. Because I think if you had a directly elected president, everyone votes in the president, then that president will have a lot more power than the Prime Minister. Whereas if the president is more like a governor general, and so all they can do is they sign bills and they don't have much power, then that would be similar to what we have now. Now, I'm not arguing that Australia has the best system here, but I'm saying that big changes come with a lot of unintended consequences. Sarah.
I just wanted to make a point on the Brexit conversation of why they would have it without having clear information on what it meant to remain or exit. And it just comes from the European Union really loves having referendums. I'm pretty sure, I think it was Ireland had a referendum on something and the people voted wrong, and then they held another one to try and get the vote right. So right. It's kind of interesting to think about the European context.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, look, and some countries, so for example, Switzerland has, and California does it as well, but Switzerland has citizen-initiated referenda that happen quite a lot. So they have quite specific questions sometimes. Some of them are quite positive, some of them are quite racist. So countries have different histories with referenda. I don't know if the US has them at all. So to get a constitutional change in the US, you need it ratified by Congress, and then 2/3 or 3/4 of all of the state congresses or something like that. Whereas we have the referenda system. I'm not a huge fan of referenda. I think there are a time and place, but you don't want to have a lot of them, is my belief. The more that you have people directly involved in government can be good, but there are downsides. Online voting. Oh, that's another question that we should come to, but I have yeah. Let's keep going. Do you think Australia's alliance relationship with the United States is important for Australia's security? Definitely yes, definitely no, somewhere else. Do you think Australia should enter more free trade agreements? Yeah, indeed. Health, should public, now I think these last five are stepping up to the even broader level of what government should be funded. Should public expenditure on health be increased or decreased? Try and think about that pre-COVID and during COVID. Defence, should public expenditure on defence be increased or decreased? Education, should public expenditure on education be increased or decreased? Old age pensions, more or less? Border protection. Okay. What I'd like to do now is pause. We'll come to wrapping these up, but I would like to pause. You go and grab a coffee for 5 minutes. But then what I'd like to do is jump into groups and just flesh out in groups a little bit how hard or easy that was. What sorts of questions were easy for you, and what sorts of questions were hard, and why? So what we'll do, I'll put you into small groups. Grab a coffee, and we'll come back at 10:21. Stop the share for a moment and breakout rooms. Okay, rooms are there. Come back at 10:21. Excellent, welcome back. Before we dive back into the stuff that we'll continue with in terms of how those questions allow us to understand some theories of politics, can I just get a brief take? How was everyone in terms of what made things easy and what made things hard in assessing those questions? Anyone want to dive in? Helen.
I've learned how to use Zoom. I'm so good on that raise hand button. I was reflecting in our group meeting that what was easy for me were the social justice questions, things like gay rights, asylum seekers. They're for me, they're easy. There's a definite answer. I know where I stand on those issues.
Yep.
The difficult questions are the ones where you've got a tension and a bit of an interplay between an economic policy and the ramifications, and whether it's a short-term ramification, whether it's a long-term ramification, and whether it's going to have flow-on effects to other areas I care about, slightly more than the economy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Other people agree with that kind of thing? Social questions may be easier, economic questions a bit tougher. Just to reflect on that, we have become, over the last 50 years, this is not a last 5-year thing. Politics in general around the world has become far more attuned to asking and answering and resolving social questions. In general, politics of the 100 years previous to that was vastly more interested in labor relations. That's basically it. Should people be allowed to unionize? What pay should people get for different things? What role should governments have in determining the makeup of the economy? 100 years ago, people did not ask social questions. That's because of the way the world was, but we are far more attuned to those things. Perhaps we are now answering them more easily. One of the interesting things I saw the other day, and I'll bet for some issues it's getting faster, but it was a graphing of how long it took for this is in the US, interracial marriage to be approved, from either the first legislation, just as a marker, the first attempted legislation, to when it became across the whole country just a norm. And I think it maybe took 25 years. Now, don't quote those numbers, but that was during the civil rights era, so in the 60s. So it took quite a long period to prosecute this social justice question all the way through. However, equal marriage, gay marriage, from the moment of the first legislation to the Supreme Court in the US enacting it for everyone, was a far shorter period, perhaps 10 years. Again, don't quote me on those exact numbers. I would say that some social questions are being asked and answered by societies far more quickly. So, for example, if we start legislating in different ways for trans rights, and I'm not quite sure what those questions would be, we may grapple with those questions faster than we grappled with similar questions 60 or 70 years ago. Again, Mitchell, I don't know the numbers. There is a post out there somewhere. I'll see if I can dig it up on that. Stephanie.
Sort of building on Helen's point, I think rather than the theme of the question is, most people would find it easier to make decisions if they knew what the outcomes were. So, and I think that's easier for social justice questions. Do you think gay people should get married? If yes, they will get married. Whereas, do you think defense spending increase? Nobody, I mean, it's harder to imagine what that looks like. And I think most people, a poll like this, you're going to vote with your gut and your gut instinct. If an issue affects you, you've already had an opinion. Whereas if you're not in defense spending, this is something that is not part of your daily sphere. So if you can clearly visualize an outcome, you're much more likely to make a decision, I think, and feel strongly about it.
Yeah. Cool. Sarah?
Yeah, similar to that one, we found the main thing was that if you don't have a lot of a political awareness, or if it's about a political issue you don't know anything about, then I mean, there's sort of no way to answer the question. But I found with pretty much all of those questions, I either had a really kind of certain like moral standpoint on like definitely yes or no, or I just didn't know enough to answer it. I did never feel like, oh, I'm not really sure how to decide. It was sort of like, oh, I need more information. I think that was the only way I could really think of it. But I think it also depends on, like, going into what Stephanie said about what's in your kind of daily sphere of like what you encounter. Say if with that one where should the minimum wage be increased, we were just talking about, it depends if you're on the minimum wage, but two, it also depends on whether or not you're making enough money to live while you're on that. But if you're also on a few $1 million a year, it may either just completely not matter to you at all. Like you say, well, that's for people on the minimum wage to answer, or you might have really strong objections to, based on how much tax you're paying and all those sorts of things. Like it all kind of plays into it. But yeah, I think it's completely different for different people, and whether or not you actually know what's going on to be able to answer the question.
Cool. Another Sarah.
Thank you. I was just going to say I had the absolute opposite sort of position in answering the questions. I found the ones that I knew more about much harder to sort of answer. Not that I found any particularly easy ones, but as someone who's done sort of security courses and an Australian security course, I found the defence questions incredibly difficult. And those.
Sorry, you muted. You went to
Sorry,
mute.
I finished. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So here's another concept that is just worth thinking about how it interrelates with people's political leanings. Now, unfortunately, I built myself a whiteboard, but I didn't build myself a duster. So I'm just going to have to draw over the top of this. So has anyone heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? So I'll draw a nice graph down at the bottom here. And so what are we going to do? Knowledge and confidence. So knowledge on the bottom here, pick any topic. Defense policy, how to take great photos, anything. As knowledge increases. So up here, you're like the world expert. Down here, you know nothing. But this one is confidence in your knowledge. And unfortunately, for all of us, there is a non-linear relationship. So you would imagine, as here is the classical version. The classical version is, as knowledge increases, confidence increases. Not the case at all. Unfortunately, knowledge increases, and you get these wildly confident people up here who actually don't know very much. And then as you get more knowledge, then you realize, oh, there's actually an awful lot out there that I don't know. and then gradually you get more confident again. But you get these wild idiots. So these are the wild idiots, the Dunning-Kruger people who actually don't know very much about the thing at all, yet are very confident in their knowledge and believe that they are pretty close to expertise at that point. All politics suffers because of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Sarah, your hand's up again.
Yeah, I just thought something that was relevant that I saw in a documentary years and years ago was really interesting, that they were telling, though it was something about discovery in the universe and what we know about planets and stuff. And they said that Albert Einstein described knowledge with geometry, and he said that the things that we know is like a circle of light, and as the circle of light expands outwards, the perimeter of darkness around it gets bigger and bigger. So what he was saying, that as our knowledge expands, the perimeter of things that are unknown around it gets bigger and bigger as well. So it's like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Absolutely.
I thought it was a really good way of explaining it.
Sadly, a humble approach to knowledge, where you are recognizing what you don't know and being humble about that, is rare in politics. Unfortunately, the people that that most countries elect are people that are high in confidence, and the people that are high in confidence tend to be right there. Now, that is not true entirely. You know, politicians can be great people. They can be highly knowledgeable, and they can be very diligent sorts of people. But we do privilege confidence a little bit, maybe too much in this system. Anyway, Amelia.
I guess though, along those lines, I've got a couple of friends who are very intelligent and have that sort of, they're also very humble about what they don't know. But it means that they're very unwilling to engage in any sort of discussion around any topics, specifically, or like it comes through very strongly with political opinions, where one of them doesn't even vote because they think that they don't have the expertise to really have a say either way.
Wow.
And so I think that, you know, at some point you do just have to make an educated guess and have to realize that you just have to, you know, stick your flag in the sand. And so I think it's dangerous to just continue to say that you don't know and that you don't have the expertise to be able to take a position on a subject.
So I'd love to ask, I know many of you in this room, or some of you in this room, are working science communicators. One of the challenges that we have in our science communication role is we talk with scientists all the time and help them to communicate their work. And for so many, particularly the younger ones, PhD students, postdocs, that kind of thing, they do know someone who knows more about that topic than them. And yet they are pretty close to the world expert. You know, if they're in the top 20 in the world on that topic, that's a hell of a lot better than everyone else. And I think that one of our challenges as science communicators is to get scientists to step off from equivocating all the time and say, okay, come on, give us your gut version, give us your best approximation, give us what you can right now. And that is a moment where you need to step a little bit into the unknown and use that confidence. And you know what? The world will be a better place by engaging in there in a qualified way, saying, look, okay, I don't know everything here, but this is my feeling of where it's likely to go, or this is my assessment. But that's a challenge. That's a challenge to get scientists who have been trained in precision and certainty as being the ultimate goals. Susie?
I am a scientist, and I work with a lot of scientists, and I was going to say that the challenge I've come up to is related to that, where people who are experts in an area are very unwilling to extrapolate, particularly to application, even when, like, primarily that is the point at which you would want them to communicate their results. Like, you want them to talk about how you'd apply their results and why their research is important. And jumping from the nitty gritty of exactly what they're doing into like how that actually impacts the world is the real challenge. And I can see, and there's a lot of anxiety around it from my perception anyway, and from the people that I know in science, there's a huge amount of of anxiety around it. And for the people who are PhDs and postdocs, I think the anxiety is higher because
Yeah, of course.
they have more on the line if something goes wrong. And so, yeah, I think it's a huge issue, but I think it is pervasive. I mean, I've worked at a number of a few institutions in a couple of different countries, and the problem is the same. So it seems to be like a sort of broad-based issue.
It is a culture of science issue. And in fact, you know, we want chunks of that. We want our PhD students and our postdocs to be as diligent as they possibly can about being as precise as they possibly can. But in other moments, we need them to step out and say, okay, all right, I'm the world expert on that river, and the river next door has a huge pollution problem. Yes, I'm not the world expert on that, but maybe I could comment a little bit about what I can do. And I think part of that is us in the science communication world supporting them, helping them as much as possible to understand that anxiety is legitimate, but it's not a simple thing. And we know there can be downsides for getting it wrong. Lee.
I was just thinking about, you know, in my work, I'm not an expert in any area of science, but I'm often speaking in a public facing way about science topics. And this does put you as a science communication practitioner, as opposed to a researcher who is a psychomer, in this position where you are potentially, you've got an audience that trusts you and sees you as authentic in some way. And then there's also this moral imperative when it comes to something like COVID, for instance. Even though my background's not in health science or epidemiology, what is my moral imperative as a psychomer to communicate with my audience? And when it comes to, like, my Twitter audience is very much the choir, but I found that talking to my Instagram audience, which is more public, people not sure what to do around COVID, I found just like anecdotally this kind of line that I can walk between just being really transparent about the level of uncertainty, but also the level of need to act despite uncertainty. And the fact that I've actually found, even just talking in my Instagram stories, which is where I've been doing a lot of this, people, general public people, if you want to call them that, have actually been quite happy to see the caveats, the level of complexity, the transparency around uncertainty, because if nothing else, it's allowed them to kind of work through the fact that schools are safe today and unsafe tomorrow, as opposed to if we don't do those caveats, sometimes people are like, what scientist said there was going to be an ice age, and now global warming's happening. They said that bacon gives me cancer, and now like something else. And I think there is a way that we can talk about complexity and things like that while remaining confident and trying to keep trust with our audience.
Yeah.
And it's just an interesting line to have to walk that I'm just noticing on a personal base.
And I assume it's one of those lines to walk that you're never perfect at, but you practice. You practice each time, thinking through these sorts of things. I think some of the words that you mentioned there, transparency, is going to be a critical one. Authenticity, qualifying, and I think these are the sorts of things that we need to talk about. The other one that that you mentioned there, I don't think you mentioned it, but I think it was implicit in what is understanding that we have to act in uncertainty. We can never act with certainty. We don't know if crossing the street that there is utter certainty of a truck coming around at whatever speed or whatever. Same with what to do in COVID, same with other government decisions. There is never certainty. And so I think we need to be operating in a risk perspective where pieces of evidence will form part of our understanding of that risk. And we'll never have the perfect, no one has ever done the perfect study that will say exactly what will happen, because even if it was very close, it was done last year, you know, not in 2 years' time when the world is different. So there is never going to be the study that will answer precisely what the question that government is asking will be, because it is just too broad. But I think if we bring that evidence in, we can understand the risk, and that will be useful. Rainer.
Yep, that's really true, Will. And sort of what I was going to say is that I'm a scientist. I started in research, and then I spent quite a lot of many years now in the public service as a scientist. And I work in risk assessment, and you have to make a decision. You can't say, I can't answer that because I've got to get some more data, or this is not close enough. A decision has to be made.
Yep.
It's not optional. And the same thing, I do some international work, and when we leave there, people stand there with their suitcases. They're not allowed to leave till everyone's agreed, and that's all there is to it. So, and I think it would be good if more scientists got involved in that sort of thing. And it would be better if it was easier for people to move out of the more academic research sphere into the public service and policy thing and back. Because it's pretty much a one-way street. Once you've left research, I've found out, there is no way back. That's it. No one will have you. That's it. You've made your decision. And I think that's terrible, because that experience is very valuable. But it's also good to keep your links to your roots to your scientific endeavors as well. And I think that we really should think about that. It would make things better, I think.
I agree entirely, Raina. I think the more that scientists and public servants are able to walk across that divide, we're going to be able to use better evidence in government decision making. Helen?
Yeah, so I came across an interesting conundrum about 3 days ago. I was talking to somebody. Look, full disclaimer, sad face, they're in my family. And one of the things that they said to me was, yeah, but how can you trust science? Because they keep changing the advice we're given. And I was making the point about the health advice with COVID, that it had now shifted to the point where now everyone in Melbourne is being advised, well, being told they have to wear masks, right? And you go back a couple of months and that wasn't their health advice, and now it is. And they were saying, yeah, but, like, we can't trust science because they changed their mind, right? How do we know they've got it right this time? They can change their mind again. And I said, oh, yeah, like, I bet you're one of those people who says that climate change isn't real because in the 70s they told you it was going to be an ice age. And they're like, exactly, it's just a model. And I was like, right, and the theory of gravity is just a theory, but, I mean, apples still fall to the ground, right? But there's this real sense that I'm getting from a small number of people, that they reject science because they don't like when it changes. And problem is that's a point of science, isn't it? That you update your findings when you get new evidence. And this is what I don't get, right? It's the whole point of science. You update it when the evidence changes, when you have enough weight to change the scientific consensus. You change it. And I don't know how to get through to those people.
It's almost like science is about learning. So I would say, I don't know where this comes from, but I think there's a little underlying element in, that phrase that people use, it's not a science, to mean something is imperfect and imprecise and uncertain. And then that sets up this idea of, science, that's when you get things lined up and perfect. And that's not science at all. And we know that. We know that science is doing our best guess with the best methods we have right now. And that hopefully next year we will have slightly better methods, slightly better data, slightly better theories, slightly better ways of accounting this, and we should learn. We should do better. So I think anytime anyone says the science keeps changing what the model is or what the theory is, say, look, that's what learning is. That's what we're doing. We're trying to get a better and better picture of what's going in the world, whatever. Yeah, exactly as Raina says, science means being wrong in public. Now, to be honest, it actually doesn't mean on some of these issues that we're changing radically. Mostly we're qualifying and tweaking. But yes, there will be some changes. But I think most of these assertions put up by climate deniers are taking willful ideas. The number of people that thought that the Earth was heading towards a snowball Earth in the 70s, it's vanishingly small. Like, no one's serious. I think most people serious had the idea, most people in sort of climate science had a pretty strong understanding of carbon emissions going up, carbon making the world hotter. There was a lot of questions and commentary on that, but this idea that we didn't really know what was going on, that's not true at all. Grace.
I was just going to say, I know a lot of people who their understanding of science is based on what they did at school. A lot of people don't even do science in their last 2 years of college because it's optional. And I think it doesn't really prepare people for what the foundations of science actually are, because people then think of it as science is what I did in the lab where I had some acetic acid or I made static electricity, and they don't learn the foundations and the philosophies of science. And I think if people learned things like philosophy of science before they started learning that, and they started understanding what falsifiability is, what it means to actually test a hypothesis, people would have a much better understanding of why it does change and why it should. But I don't know. I don't know how to teach philosophy to kids, so I can't solve it one.
Well, you can teach philosophy to kids, but by the same token, we have we can only teach people to teach things that people are interested in. And so I think it's our job as science communicators, as much as possible, to try and make people interested. Never force them, but see if we can open that door and get people to engage with what's going on. Let's continue with what I want to talk about in terms of threading together those questions into, no, I don't want to do that, I want to do some theories of politics that will help us to understand what we're doing, what the purpose of government is. Now let's just let me put that on. And so the reason I ask all of these questions is it gets us thinking about, okay, what is the purpose of government? Now, of course, that first spectrum there is, are they easy or hard? That's an interesting one. But now what I want to do is use something that many of you will have seen before. This is the output variable that is given by these vote compass sorts of orientations. On the left-hand axis, on the horizontal axis, we go from left to right. And this will be on, actually, no, I've got it the other way. On the vertical axis, we go from what role should governments play in our social lives? To the top are liberal sorts of answers, and the bottom are conservative sorts of answers. By conservative, we mean typically follow the dictates of tradition, what things were like 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Liberal means more freedom for individuals, and change is fine. We'll flesh these out a little bit more. On the right-hand side, on the horizontal axis, what role should governments play in our economic lives? So on the far right, governments should play very little role in our economic lives. On the far left, governments should play a big role in our economic lives. Now, the dots that you can see on the screen are what you get as an outcome from answering all of those questions. So I cunning got exactly in the middle, so I could remain ambiguous. I'm that black dot there. In Australia, the political parties there, the Greens up to the top left-hand corner, the Liberal Party in the sort of bottom right-handy corner, the Labor Party there in between the Greens and me, or the dot that I made. So the sorts of questions that we should start thinking about is, so a way of rephrasing the idea about social lives is, what can we as individuals do? That's a simpler way of saying, you know, who can we marry? What rules should there be on what we can do in terms of use of drugs, those kinds of things. And the simpler way of phrasing the economic question is, who gets what? There are some people who say that one definition of politics is basically who gets what. I don't know if that covers everything, but that is at the base of a lot of political consideration. Now, what I want to do now is raise a few political ideologies that help us to think about, okay, where do different groups and people stand on these sorts of questions? Now, we'll go through these one by one. Many of you will have heard of many of these things before, and probably have a pretty decent account of many of them. But they're useful for us to just sort of think, okay, what is the bundle of thinking and the tradition that underpins many of the sorts of philosophies that people in government will ascribe to? It also gives us a nice insight of where we can bring evidence to the political process. Now, I want to say two things before we dive into these. First, obviously the labels that I've got here are not fixed ideologies that stay static in time at all times. They are constantly evolving as new questions emerge, new technologies change what government can and can't do, what people can and can't do. And so there will be traditions that move in different sorts of directions. Secondly, the labels that I've got there, communism, libertarianism, authoritarianism, are very much used in a pejorative sense. They're used by people to say, oh, you're just a, whatever it is. Now, of course, that's useful, and it's probably useful to castigate many of the people who raise these sorts of ideologies. But what I do want to raise from the very beginning is that hopefully, as I go through very short snapshot pictures of these ideologies, that you should be able to find something good about all of them. And that doesn't mean you have to all of a sudden change your political calculation from being wherever to somewhere else, but instead that you should be able to see at least some of the upsides of these different ideologies. Because if you can't see any upsides to an ideology, then how can it possibly even exist in society? There must be some framing that is positive. Yes, they might have huge negatives. We can come to that later. But those who ascribe to any particular ideology need to see positives, and they need to be sort of universal positives that most people would take. So let's dive in. The first one, and the reason I start with this, is that it's a useful one for many people to start thinking about, okay, where are the positives in these ideologies that I don't hold? So a traditionalist or a conservative, a traditional conservative, is someone who is oriented towards upholding or maintaining tradition, especially so as to resist change. Now, Michael Oakeshott's quote there is a fairly useful one. But the ways that I like to think about a conservative is that on one side, a conservative will say, okay, it's better to have small change than wait around for giant disruptive change. But also a conservative will say things like, is it not worth preserving a nice view? So for example, you like taking a drive on the weekend and you like having a picnic at a nice picnic spot. If it's got a nice view there, isn't that something about the universe or the world or society or your local town that is worth preserving? A traditionalist will say, okay, there are probably quite a few things like that. But the generous, trying to be generous to a traditionalist is to say that surely there are some things about the world that our parents and their parents got right enough to keep. So that's what I'd try and argue there for traditionalists, is that probably there are some things in the world that are worth keeping. Now, you may not agree with all forms of traditionalists, and many traditionalists want to keep things for the sake of keeping things. But I think that it is worth saying there is probably some elements of traditionalism and conservatism that is worth holding on to. To be conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. Just in the chat, are there people here who would not identify themselves as traditionalists, but would agree with much of the sentiment of that quote?
Yeah, Will, I definitely would.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly things that I think are worth preserving. For example, things like cultural traditions, richness of experiences of food, of living, of art,
Yep.
of music. There are many things that are worth preserving. But I would disagree with the second part of that sentence, especially so as to resist change. I would agree with the first bit.
Yep.
Preserve tradition, respect tradition, value tradition, and everything that comes with it, but don't give up social progress.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's interesting, the tried to the untried. A lot of this sort of conservatism and traditionalism can be pointed back to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke's one of the sort of John Howard's favorite philosophers, founding father of conservative thinking and the Conservative Party in the UK. He was writing at the time of the French Revolution. And he attempted in some of his writing to understand from an English perspective, an English-Irish perspective. And he attempted in some of his writing to understand, okay, why would people want all of these things? I can understand you would want a society guided by reason. But then he saw the terror and thought, okay, things are getting a little bit out of hand. So, you know, I prefer the familiar to, you know, the unknown that carries so much more risks. Authoritarianism. Authoritarianism borrows much from a traditionalist orientation, but is more a political perspective where power is centralized into a single executive, typically one man. In fact, I don't think there has been someone who you would call a full-on authoritarian dictator who is not male. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe no one wants that. Maybe we shouldn't want any authoritarians. Now, constraints on political institutions and groups, but uses a lot of emotion, identifies the regime as a necessary evil to combat easily recognizable societal problems. Constraints on mass public, ill-defined executive power. Can anyone think of a moment when an authoritarian ruler might be worth having?
In war?
In war. And typically even in democratic societies, democratic leaders will become more authoritarian. In pandemics, as Alyssa says, yes, absolutely. Or another classic example potentially is in climate change. So for example, a lot of people a few years ago were raising the argument that democracies were ill-equipped to deal with climate change, whereas authoritarian countries could just say, this is what we need to do. Newly independent nations typically are often more authoritarian. There is obviously a vast difference between different dictators. On the one side, you have those who centralize power in themselves, brook no disagreement, and are terrible to their populations. We can think of heaps of examples. Franco there, name any other authoritarian ruler of the 20th century. Yeah, Duterte, absolutely. But then on the opposite end, you can name people like, okay, I'm going back 2,000 years, Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, a benign dictator, or at least he attempted to be more of a benign dictator. The argument there is it takes away a lot of the discussion and you can have more stability in society and then bring back more democratic rule. Typically authoritarians rise in moments of extreme crisis or periods or eras of extreme crisis. Yes, Singapore is a great example. And these can be just leanings. And there may be times when they are able to solve problems more effectively than more democratic discussion. The risk, of course, is that they close out a lot of discussion and might be keeping some problems boiling away that might continue. Yeah, Machiavelli said the best leader you could hope for was a benevolent dictator. I don't know if Machiavelli was right on everything. But he did, yes, indeed, he did think so. Yeah, authoritarians works depending on what the definition of work is, but too many people get shot. Not always, but often, and that's the risk of authoritarian powers. Libertarianism. Here I've conceptualized it via Ayn Rand. Indeed, an economic system in which transactions between private parties are free from government interference, such as regulations, privileges, tariffs, and subsidies. So a libertarian would typically argue that as much as possible, government should stay out of both of our personal lives and our economic lives. So that means a libertarian would be very, very open to the idea of people are allowed to take any drugs that they want, people are allowed to marry who they like, and they're allowed to do whatever they like in terms of making contracts with each other and setting up companies that are doing whatever they want. Libertarians typically believe that as much as possible, individuals should relate to each other as individuals. And I kind of, that's where the strength of the philosophy is. It's everyone dealing with each other as adults. However, people have vastly different power. People have based on money, and so are able to exploit other people very easily. Libertarians also don't really truck with the environment very much. Yeah, indeed. As Justin says, lie around, smoke weed, poison the water supply. So that's an interesting question there, Stephanie. I feel like these political groups can be boiled down to, do you care about other people or not? And indeed, there is a strong line in all of these. How much do you care or recognize other people? Some libertarians will argue that, no, I care about other people, by saying that they should stand on their own 2 feet. Whereas, and then they might say, all those other ideologies, they are just infantilizing people. They're having government being a nanny state or something like that.
I sort of I get where you're coming from, but libertarian specifically falls down because you cannot have perfect freedom and live in a society. Like, you cannot do whatever you want and expect the same of someone else and live happily together. Like, you can stand on my throat, but I can't stand on yours. Like,
so I'm not raising an argument for libertarianism. I'm just raising it as a place on the political spectrum and saying that there will be elements of libertarianism that many people would say, oh, okay. So, for example, a libertarian might be might be one of the early people to prosecute arguments for equal marriage, to say, why should government care about that kind of thing? Which many here might say, oh, well, that's entirely legitimate. But I agree with what you're saying there, Stephanie. As Susie's got there, another axis, do you trust other people? Yes, indeed. I'm not sure which of these actually trust other people, but yeah, that's a difficult question. All right, the classical liberals. So whereas the libertarians may be more extreme in their rejection of government, a classical liberal seems to be a little bit more coping with the idea of government. This is an expansive circle. There are a lot of people that identify themselves in various elements of classical liberalism. Probably over the last few years, actually, it's drifted more towards the right. But the key thing underpinning this is largely a social question. So it's largely about saying what people can do to each other. So the classical definition of classical liberalism comes from John Stuart Mill. Is that we should be allowed to do whatever we want so long as we don't harm other people, which sounds like a pretty reasonable sort of thing. You should be allowed to go and play football in the park so long as you don't harm other people. You should be allowed to marry who you like as long as you don't harm other people. But of course, it gets very difficult to understand what a harm to another person is. So smoking is the classic question here. So smoking, a classical liberals will say, I'm just hurting myself. This is my lungs, my cigarettes. I can do what I like with this. Other people will say, well, actually, are you going to be a burden on the public health system in 30 years' time? And therefore, you're going to be costing me money. So it's not as simple as saying, if you don't harm other people. What do you mean by right there, that question, Stephanie?
Like, does right mean more conviction, or like right on
the right-hand side of the...
Yes, like, why are they both over there? What do they have in common that they don't have?
Yeah, okay, so both of those groups will have, so the traditionalists and the classical liberals will have people in there who have different sorts of opinions on the role of government. And so you could imagine a traditionalist who says, yeah, government should intervene a fair bit to support minimum wages or that kind of thing. Or a traditionalist might say, no, 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 let's give more power to companies. So something like that. Same for the classical liberals. They have some of those debates are not essential to what's framing their mind. I think the difference between classical liberals and traditionalists is their approach to personal and social justice sorts of questions, social sorts of questions.
Okay, so if you're looking at the y-axis, that would be government intervention, but then what is the left, or the x-axis rather?
So government.
Why would you be
government? So up and down, the y-axis is on social questions. What can you do as an individual? Recreational drugs, who you can marry, those kinds of questions. And then the left-right axis, the x-axis, is about the role of money in society and how the economy works.
Okay. Because like I get that we're sort of limited here with that this is the vote poll compass, this is where we're coming from, but like a lot about the essential beliefs of these different groups doesn't really track with that. But that's okay. I will puzzle it out.
Look, so what I would say is that these are not fixed, and they're not perfect descriptions of them. Rather, they're just useful groupings for us to be able to understand, okay, what sorts of traditions might people be coming from? And as I'll come to at the bottom of this, there are a whole bunch of things that will mean ideologies don't really mean very much on the ground. So we'll come to that as we go on. So the last two groups are groups that point more towards a role of government in people's economic lives. So communist philosophy, coming originally from Karl Marx, classic definition there, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which is saying government should have a pretty strong role in people's lives. Communists would be very focused on government owning the means of production, and that there is no role for capital in society other than government-controlled capital. Do I have the socialists here? Similar sorts of orientation, but probably more socially liberal and more democratic in this. Now, the reason I put up this chart is I like this. This is from Thomas Piketty's last book. No, not last book, the book before. Capital in the 21st Century, which is well worth a read. And what it does say is one of the key orientations of socialists or social democrats is not towards the owning of who owns capital, as the communists will point towards, but a slightly more nuanced question looking at inequality in society. So inequality in society says, how much do the richest people own compared with how much do the poorest people own? Inequality is massively on the rise around the world at the moment, although I don't know what COVID is doing to it. And has been for the last 40 years or so. The interesting thing here is that Australia is historically and globally really quite equal, aside from key people that have been marginalised in Australian political life. But Australia has been a far more equal society than the rest of the world. And you know, there was a time when Australia was called the workers' paradise for the people that are let in, or for white people. So here's a question for you. What sorts of knowledge do these ideologies trust? How do we want to answer this? What's the next question? We'll do the practical governance question in a second. Can we break into groups for 5 minutes? What sorts of knowledge do these groups trust? Do you want the same groups as before or different groups?
Doesn't matter.
All right, breakout rooms. You can have the same groups as before. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Try and work out give a list of all of them. What do they all trust?
Will. I'm actually not sure how to go into a group. I think I accidentally just left.
Do you have a group? Let me see. Unassigned. So you, George? All right, I'll assign you to that
sorry.
one.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Okay. Now, what I want to do is just quickly go through what sorts of knowledge these ideologies trust, and then we're going to apply this into a more practical example. So that was tough. Sorry, Sean, you're mid-thought. I can't help. I don't know where your thoughts are up to. Happened to me the other day. It's tough. Why was that tough?
I thought it was tough because it was like I was thinking of the example of like the UK and the Netherlands. They both have monarchies, but they're also they trust science and they're kind of like they lead the world. And so it's sort of like, well, where does that fit? That's incredibly traditional, the fact that they have monarchies still, but they're also incredibly progressive. So I didn't actually know how to fit that in this graph. Like I didn't kind of know where that lay.
Yeah, well, I feel like you could have given us a lot more clarity on this question. It would have made answering it a lot easier. Because I thought of 4 different ways to answer the question.
I don't want to make it easy for you. I'm sorry, Helen. What I want you to do is think through these things, because it will get easier when we actually apply this in a second, because there aren't hard and fast answers. And in a sense, all of those blobs that I've put up there are what's the word? Hyperboles. They're extreme versions of what actually happens in real life. No one is a perfect traditionalist or perfect communist or perfect libertarian, because they can hold that ideology in the abstract. But then when it comes down to it, governments and individuals have to make decisions based on concrete things that happen right in front of them. And that might mean that whilst you might say, okay, in general, I have libertarian leanings or classic liberal leanings or socialist leanings or whatever it is, when it comes down to it, there are still problems that come up for government that don't necessarily fit directly into their basket. It doesn't necessarily say, oh, straight away, we can answer this question in a libertarian light or a classical liberal light. Contingency matters an awful lot. And so whilst we might be able to say, okay, these sorts of groups will follow this sort of knowledge or like this sort of knowledge, it's not as simple as that. So how did people come to any answers on, Ali?
Yeah, in our group, we were kind of talking about ideas of individualistic kind of points of view versus collective understandings of trust as well. So for example, someone who's a libertarian might be more trusting of their own personal frameworks of understanding and their own personal opinions, whereas in something like authoritarian government, and the government has to have trust in their own people and their own allies for it to be successful. So we talked about how something like socialism and communism is more collective trust, trusting in, you know, your fellow people and trusting that they are going to do what's best for everyone, and that also the government is going to be distributing things equally. Whereas something like libertarianism further to that end is more like you don't have to have that trust in the government because you believe that you and your knowledge is enough to make you successful.
I think that's a good point. I think it's a good point. We can start to pull them apart when we say things like that. When we say, okay, libertarians, the source of knowledge that matters most to them is their own opinions, their own stance in the world. Now that doesn't mean they can't become educated and read things, but it's then based on their own decision making. Versus, for example, an authoritarian will say, okay, the sorts of knowledge that matters most out of all of this is simply the hierarchies of where people fit in the authoritarian structure. So the only true problems to an authoritarian are when people deviate from hierarchies, when people do things outside of outside of the structure of society. Belinda.
Hey, yeah, look, I think one of the most interesting things that we came up with was that there's maybe only the classical liberals who we thought would really be interested in scientific information. You know, we thought that at the extremes of right and left, you'd have, the authoritarians and the communists would like information that they control or that their in-group produces. The conservatives would like just traditional, things that are very historical, that don't invite much change. And so, looking around, personally, I was really affected by that. The conclusion I came to, that the classical liberals might be the only ones that really respond to science in the way that we as science communicators might want people to.
So I would say that the more anyone is ideological in any direction, then inherently what they are doing is fitting an ideology onto the world. And the point about science is it's saying, well, the world should tell, facts about the world should tell you what to do. And so the more that someone is an ideologue, they are likely to try and fit that onto the world. So science becomes difficult for people who are ideologically motivated. Now, of course, science comes with its biases and comes with how we're producing that knowledge and the questions that we're asking. But the more that someone is oriented towards being open to what the world is showing them, then they are less likely to be ideologically motivated. The more that they are looking for certain things in the world based on an ideology, then the more they are likely to distrust science. We'll come back to that in a bit. What I want to do now is start implementing these. What's the difference between those two? All right, we'll come to that later. We'll see where we get to. What I want to do is spend a solid amount of time now exploring how you believe these ideologies would attempt to solve the problem that I posed last week. So previously, I gave you the idea of a doctor detecting elevated levels of lead in children's blood. Now what I want to do is get you to spend time in a group, and I'll give you one position each group, and explore, okay, how would they respond to this challenge? What would they do in terms of collecting knowledge? And then in terms of enacting a solution, where would their lens focus them? So what I'll do is I'll put you back into the same groups you were in before, and I will just go around. You'll know your group numbers. Here's what we'll do. If you are, how many groups do we have? Do you remember your group numbers? I can give you your task. All right, so breakout 1, we'll start as a clock at 12 o'clock. Breakout room 1, you can do classical liberals. Breakout room 2, libertarianism. Breakout room 3, authoritarianism. Breakout room 4, traditionalists. Breakout room 5, communists. Breakout room 6, socialists. Breakout room 7, classical liberals. Breakout room 8, libertarians. Breakout room 9, authoritarians. Breakout room 10, traditionalists. Breakout room 11 is communists. Breakout room 12 is socialists. Breakout room 13, classical liberals. And breakout room 14, libertarians. So let's dive in there. Let's take 15 minutes to explore in your groups how you believe they would react. And we'll come back at 11:40 and finish this up. Yell out if you need reminding which group you were.
What was 10?
Ooh, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Traditionalists.
Thank you.
I'm just going to resume that there, but we have 3 minutes to go, and I do have to go because I've got another meeting I've got to get into. What I'll say here is there are two other sections in the slides that are worth going over in your own time if you can. The first one just pulls apart some of this to say ideologies are abstract. They operate in the abstract, but they give us an understanding of how people view the role of government in the world. But the key things that will mitigate that, there's a whole bunch of different things that we can help to understand it. Culture, history, all of those kinds of things. But the two critical things that we always have to think about is, okay, what are the power structures that are organizing that society at the time? So that even if there is an ideology pointing that direction, power might point in a different direction. And the second one is the contingency, the details, the things that are germane. That mine, if it was in Australia, is going to be in a very different situation from if that mine is in China, Brazil, the United States, Russia, England. All of these depend on the local cultures, the local characteristics, the local histories. So as much as ideologies give us a way of approaching the world, the details on the ground matter. The second thing, the second part of the slides that we're not going to get to cover is the role of the scientist in this. And there's a useful description there. Actually, I'll just quickly show you this screen. No, not that one. That one. Before I go, you got to give me one more minute. Getting text from the boss. Between proactive to reactive, do you go forward and push the science in, or do you wait until the politician asks for you? Or myopic, meaning you have one particular issue that you're focused on, or contextual, you try and look at the whole lot. All right, I'll stop that there, and I'll see you all next week. Otherwise, my boss will get cranky at me for not being in the meeting in time. See you later.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks.